Along the southern coast of Chile, the land met the Pacific in a long, uneven line. Forests of lenga and alerce trees moved slowly in the wind. Rivers widened as they approached the sea, carrying silt from the Andes toward sheltered bays. Small towns were spread along this edge, separated by water, hills, and distance. Roads were limited. Boats were common. Radio was often the only reliable connection between communities. In 1960, life here followed established rhythms. Fishing boats left before dawn. Sawmills operated near rivers where timber could be moved downstream. Farms were small and family-run. Earthquakes were familiar, accepted as part of living along the boundary between tectonic plates. Buildings were simple, often wooden, designed to flex rather than resist. Preparedness existed, but it was informal, shaped by memory rather than regulation. The geography encouraged self-reliance. Many towns maintained their own power generators, wells, and food stores. Supplies arrived irregularly. Weather determined schedules more than clocks did. In some areas, the coastline had not been formally mapped in decades. Nothing on the morning of May 22 suggested interruption. The sea moved as it always had. The ground was still. Daily tasks began without urgency. There was no immediate sign that the landscape itself was about to change. Southern Chile lies along the boundary where the Nazca Plate moves beneath the South American Plate. This subduction zone had shaped the region for millions of years. Volcanic ranges, deep ocean trenches, and frequent seismic activity were the visible outcomes of that movement. By 1960, residents understood this history in practical terms. Earthquakes were part of the inherited knowledge of the coast. The communities affected by the later disaster were not uniform. Valdivia was a regional center, with a population approaching 50,000. It had schools, hospitals, industry, and a port that connected it to other parts of the country. Smaller towns such as Corral, Puerto Saavedra, and coastal villages along the Golfo de Anca depended on fishing, timber, and local trade. Many settlements were accessible only by boat or unpaved roads that became unreliable in winter. Housing reflected available materials rather than engineering standards. Wood was abundant and commonly used. Brick and concrete were present in larger towns but less common in rural areas. Buildings were rarely reinforced to modern seismic standards, which were still evolving globally at the time. Despite this, previous earthquakes had caused damage without complete collapse, reinforcing a belief that structures would endure. Chile in 1960 was also managing social and economic pressures. Resources were unevenly distributed. Emergency planning existed at a national level, but communication infrastructure in the south was limited. Telegraph lines followed main routes. Telephone service was sparse outside cities. Radio was the primary link between isolated areas and the rest of the country. Many families had lived in the same places for generations. Cemeteries, churches, and docks marked continuity with the past. The coastline itself was treated as stable, even though historical records showed gradual uplift and subsidence after earlier earthquakes. Few anticipated that these processes could occur suddenly, at a scale beyond previous experience. When the first tremors arrived earlier that day, they were noted but not alarming. People paused, waited, and resumed work. The larger event had not yet announced itself. At 3:11 in the afternoon on May 22, 1960, the earthquake began. Its epicenter lay near the coast, close to the city of Valdivia. The shaking intensified rapidly and continued far longer than any recent memory. Instruments later measured its magnitude at 9.5, the largest earthquake ever recorded. The motion was not a single violent jolt but a sustained movement. Buildings swayed. Roads split. Riverbanks collapsed into the water. In Valdivia, the ground subsided by more than 2 meters in places, allowing rivers to reverse direction. Wooden structures bent and twisted. Masonry failed. Bridges became impassable. The duration of the shaking, estimated at around 10 minutes, exhausted people physically and mentally. Standing was difficult. Movement was uncertain. When the motion finally eased, the landscape was altered. Streets were flooded. Fires burned where fuel lines had ruptured. Power and communications failed almost immediately. Along the coast, the earthquake triggered a tsunami. In some areas, the sea withdrew suddenly, exposing the seabed. Minutes later, waves returned with force. Entire sections of shoreline were overtaken. Boats were carried inland or destroyed. In towns like Puerto Saavedra, much of the settlement was erased. After the water receded, survivors faced an unfamiliar environment. Landmarks were gone. Coastlines had shifted. In some regions, the ground had risen, in others, it had sunk permanently below sea level. Roads, docks, and rail lines no longer connected communities. By nightfall, large areas of southern Chile were isolated. No external assistance had arrived. Radios were silent or damaged. What remained were groups of people separated from the state, the economy, and each other, standing within a landscape that no longer behaved as expected. In the days that followed, survival became a practical matter of organization rather than endurance alone. Formal systems had failed quickly. Power stations were damaged or submerged. Water networks were contaminated by saltwater and debris. Fuel supplies were inaccessible. With roads broken and ports destroyed, outside aid could not reach many areas for weeks. Communities began by accounting for who remained. In towns where records survived, local officials and volunteers compiled lists by hand. In smaller villages, this process was informal. People gathered in open spaces, often on higher ground, and took note of absences. Injuries were treated with limited supplies. Serious cases could not be moved. Food sources varied. In agricultural areas, stored grain and livestock provided some stability. Along the coast, fishing was initially impossible due to debris and altered shorelines. Rivers, now flowing differently, carried sediment that affected fish stocks. People adapted by collecting shellfish where the seabed had been exposed and harvesting what remained from damaged fields. Shelter was improvised. Tents were made from salvaged wood and fabric. Some families moved inland temporarily, following paths that were still passable on foot. Others stayed near their homes, uncertain whether relocation would be safer. Rain and cold were constant concerns, particularly as winter approached. Health risks increased steadily. Without clean water, gastrointestinal illness spread. Cuts became infected. Medical professionals were scarce outside major cities, and hospitals that remained standing were overwhelmed. Care depended on basic sanitation measures and isolation of the sick when possible. Decision-making was decentralized. In the absence of communication with regional authorities, local leaders took responsibility for rationing, security, and coordination. In some towns, church buildings served as meeting points if they remained intact. Elsewhere, schools or open fields were used. Time was experienced differently. Days were measured by daylight and immediate needs rather than calendars. Aftershocks continued, reinforcing caution and limiting reconstruction efforts. Some residents slept outdoors for weeks, fearing collapse of remaining structures. Gradually, limited contact was re-established. Battery-powered radios began receiving signals from Santiago. Information was incomplete and delayed, but it confirmed that the disaster extended far beyond any single town. Knowing this did not change immediate conditions, but it provided context. Survival continued to depend on cooperation, restraint, and the careful use of diminishing resources. As weeks passed, the cumulative effects of isolation became clearer. The initial shock had been survived by many, but its secondary consequences continued to shape daily life. In areas where land had subsided, flooding became permanent. Fields that once produced crops were now wetlands. Homes stood partially underwater, unusable even if structurally intact. Families who had lived in the same places for generations were forced to leave without a clear destination. Physical decline was gradual rather than sudden. Diets narrowed as stored food was exhausted. Protein intake dropped in inland areas. Along the coast, shellfish remained a key resource, but concerns about contamination were poorly understood at the time. Illness reduced the ability of some adults to work, placing additional strain on others. The elderly and very young were the most vulnerable. Deaths continued after the earthquake itself. Some resulted from untreated injuries. Others followed exposure, infection, or the worsening of chronic conditions. Records from remote communities are incomplete, and exact numbers remain uncertain. What is known is that mortality did not end on May 22. It extended into the following months, largely unseen by the wider country. Psychological pressure increased as uncertainty persisted. Without reliable timelines for assistance, planning became difficult. Some communities attempted relocation as a group, traveling inland on foot or by makeshift boats. These movements were slow and risky. Others chose to remain, adapting to reduced expectations and altered surroundings. Aftershocks reinforced instability. Even weakened structures that had survived the main event were lost later. Each tremor disrupted sleep and delayed rebuilding. The sense of time stretching without resolution affected decision-making and morale, though it was rarely discussed openly. By the time sustained relief efforts began reaching the most isolated areas, many survivors were already physically depleted. What they required most was not dramatic rescue, but steady support, medical care, clean water, and the means to rebuild lives in places that were no longer the same. National and international assistance arrived in stages. The scale of the disaster made rapid response impossible. Chile's government prioritized restoring communication lines and reopening ports. Naval vessels delivered supplies to coastal areas that could not be reached by road. In some towns, aid arrived weeks after the initial event. In others, it took longer. Relief was uneven. Larger population centers received attention first, not by design but by accessibility. Smaller communities remained dependent on their own organization even as formal assistance increased elsewhere. When medical teams arrived, they encountered conditions shaped by months of adaptation rather than immediate crisis. Treatment focused on stabilizing long-term illness, addressing malnutrition, and preventing further outbreaks of disease. Reconstruction raised new questions. In places where the land had permanently subsided, rebuilding in the same location was no longer possible. Entire towns were relocated to higher ground. Cemeteries were moved. Property boundaries lost meaning where coastlines had shifted by hundreds of meters. These decisions were administrative, but their effects were personal and lasting. Economic recovery was slow. Fisheries took years to return to previous productivity. Agricultural patterns changed with the altered landscape. Many residents left the region permanently, contributing to demographic shifts that continued into the following decades. The disaster became a reference point in Chilean policy and science. Building standards were revised. Seismic monitoring improved. Yet for those who lived through the isolation, recovery was not defined by reform, but by the gradual return of routine. Electricity, clean water, and regular supply schedules marked the end of survival mode. The 1960 earthquake left southern Chile permanently altered. Coastlines rose and fell. Rivers changed course. Maps were redrawn to reflect a new physical reality. For scientists, the event became a benchmark in the study of seismic activity. For the country, it marked a division between before and after. The survival of isolated communities during the months that followed was not defined by dramatic escape or singular acts of heroism. It was sustained by routine decisions made under constrained conditions, often without external support. Much of this endurance was undocumented, recorded only in local memory. Today, traces of the earthquake remain visible in the landscape. Raised beaches and sunken forests serve as quiet evidence of sudden change. The story of survival in 1960 is not one of triumph, but of adaptation to forces beyond control, and of continuity in a place where the ground itself cannot be assumed to remain still.